All right, moving along. We got A&M in Florida to talk about, and this is really a tale of one team that's deflated and another team that's kind of sky high. Both teams lost last week, and I know A&M fans aren't big into moral victories, but I also think that there's something to take away from how they played in this game, how that crowd kept them in the game, how they just pure emotion kept them hanging around, and then talent and grit sort of almost put them in a chance to win at the end. So A&M fans, we saw a lot there that we liked Saturday, and look, no moral victory there, but you have a reason to be positive. So we know what happened in the Alabama A&M game last week. We're going to talk about it a little bit, but give me a little on Florida, what you saw against LSU. Was this the exact way that you thought it would play out? I want to remind people that are listening to this and that maybe haven't seen some of the other videos. We did pick LSU, both of us, to win that game last week. Where is Florida at right now?
Florida kind of is a little bit what we thought they were. We said going into last week, Florida and LSU both had real issues on defense. And Florida went into that game giving up 124% of opponent rush averages, 102% of opponent passing averages. Those are bad numbers. And the thing we really identified was that the linebackers and safeties, and to some extent the corners, really weren't tackling very well. I think the corners, Dawson's, they're fine. But they had two guys, in Davis and Anzalone, that were elite NFL players. And Davis may not have been that high of a recruit, but he ends up being a first-round draft pick. They've got two other starters that were top 100 players. One of them gets arrested, so he doesn't get drafted. And then Anzalone, of course, is the NFL. Chauncey Gardner may be very good in coverage, but he struggles tackling. There's a lot of talk during the game about him getting tired and all these other things. I mean, maybe that's sort of true, but I just think he's not that big and physical, frankly. He's a little small for a corner, and he just has a hard time tackling big backs in space, especially when he gets tired. The muscles start to wear out, and he doesn't have the physicality needed to stand up. So we didn't think that Florida was going to really be able to handle LSU's run game. And the whole trick with LSU is if you can stack the box and make them one-dimensional, they don't have the passing game you need to control them. I think more importantly, though, Canada really invented ways to generate offense. Florida only gave up 2.9 yards per carry to tailbacks in that game. Longest run by the two main running backs on 29 carries was 9 yards. Where Florida struggled was on the edges. Florida could not deal with Texas A&M using their, they could deal with LSU using their big, physical, strong, fast receivers like Gage on jet sweeps and motions around the edge. And Davis not Davis, but Reese and Joseph are just not fast enough to catch the edge. And it's tough because when you play Texas A&M, that's their offense. They're going to throw the ball to guys like Osborne and Kirk on the perimeter, and they've got Kellen Mond in the play action pass game and the zone read game. And there's a lot of assignments you've got to keep. You've got to play perimeter to perimeter because that's their whole offense. And Florida struggled with an LSU team that was really trying to generate that kind of style of offense, just through almost through smoke and mirrors, frankly. And now they're going to be tasked with facing an offense that does that. I mean, really, as a matter of course. I mean, that's what A&M wants to do. That's how they operate, and it's going to be tough because when they start to struggle and when they have a hard time with that receiver screen, and when they have a hard time with the motions and the sweeps, that's going to cause the linebackers to cheat outside, and they're going to struggle with the interior run game. And then they're going to kind of get flat-footed, or they're going to be very aggressive, and then they're going to blow an assignment, and they're going to let Kellen Mond run free for 40 yards. And so when you play A&M, you need to be very assignment sound because they spread you out so much, and you need to be very careful to make sure you're doing all your assignments. And that's not a good thing because that's exactly what Florida struggled with. Nussmeier doesn't help. I mean, they're a very predictable offense. They struggle taking yardage and generating points offensively. Because they don't have a great rushing offense, frankly. The passing game is kind of sporadic, and their quarterback situation's been difficult. So you put all that together, and so far, really, it's been hidden by the fact that they've played teams that haven't been able to run the ball. Two of the four opponents, I mean, under 3 yards of carry. So it's just hard to predict them being able to stop a team that is still a run first team in A&M that uses so many spread concepts.
So we don't talk a lot about gut and we don't talk a lot about emotion. We're a numbers driven channel. But coming out of this past weekend with A&M and Florida, do you see the potential for this to be kind of a runaway thing where Florida's already a little deflated and then more of the same happens with A&M? Or is there a chance that A&M is a little too high coming into this game and they get frustrated because they see things aren't going as easy as they thought they were going to go against Florida, and kind of stub their toe a little bit?
I think both things have merit, right? Florida is probably, a lot of Florida fans were expecting to beat LSU, and they were disappointed that it doesn't. And, it's kind of frustrating, to be honest, when you read comments before the game and people were calling us morons because we said LSU's going to win and we're ridiculous and we're off base. We were just going by what the numbers were telling us. And we do this so that we're not just speaking in hindsight. We can say, we ran a model and it said that LSU was a slight favorite over Florida in that game. And then we both picked LSU because of that. There were signs that Florida wasn't going to win that game. And I think right now what you're dealing with is a little bit more of a crashed reality. And it's tough and it is deflating, but at the same time, they still got a lot to play for. I think what may be worse is A&M side. They came back in that Alabama game in large part because there was that fumble, the 24-3 score, and the crowd goes crazy because you're at home. There's 101,000 people, and every time you do something right, they scream, and every time you do something wrong, maybe they clap, but not much happens. And the defense has a ton of noise on their side to stymie, Alabama's offense. I think Hurts actually does get rattled. He may not show it, and there's a lot of talk, and there's this whole prestige about him being this unrattable player, but I think he does play like it. I think it does affect him, and I think that home crowd did affect them. So my biggest thing with A&M is with a true freshman starter in the swamp. Now, when he does something right, no one's going to say anything. But when he does something wrong, that whole crowd's going to go crazy, and all that momentum is going to be on the defensive side for Florida, and that's a much, much tougher environment for a true freshman to play.
If they show up for the game and aren't too deflated already. So I do want to at some point touch on what we saw, and maybe you can kind of wrap that into this question as well, what we saw from A&M against Alabama. But the question I have for you, because we like to talk about matchups here a lot, if we're looking at the offense, the A&M offense matching up against this Florida defense, and we've talked about Florida's struggles in the run game defensive side of the ball a good bit. I think they're a pretty decent pass defense. But all that being said, is this the best running back core and best quarterback that maybe Florida's seen this year?
Well, I certainly think it's probably the best quarterback they've seen, because if you go down the list, you got Michigan with Spate, who threw 2 pick sixes in that game, really kept Florida in the game. Not a very good quarterback. Michigan struggled this past week, lost to Michigan State, I know, with O'Korn, but just, O'Korn had been better than Spate when he came in afterwards. Tennessee has been a disaster at the quarterback position. Kentucky's Johnson's actually been pretty good. I'm not sure that he's not the best of this list, because at LSU you got Edling, who's terrible, and at Vanderbilt you've got Shermer, who we both think is kind of overrated. So at least in terms of quarterbacks, I do think Mond's the best, and I think Mond as a high 4-star, 5-star sort of player, he's flashed the potential of the sort of player that can become an all SEC guy. There's a lot of hype about Shea Patterson. I think Shea Patterson's overrated. I think he's very inaccurate. He likes to try to be Johnny Manziel, but he's not Johnny Manziel. He makes a lot of throws without his feet set and all that kind of stuff. And he makes a lot of inaccurate passes. And he's been consistently a sub 60% passer against good teams. We're not seeing that from Mond. Mond is playing at a high level. He's getting better every week, which I know is something of a cliche, but in this case, it's true. He's making good reads. He's making good decisions. And I think he's going to turn into shape to probably be one of the better passers in the conference. In the past couple weeks, 70% passing against South Carolina, 66% passing against Alabama. Those are great numbers. He had one slightly rough game against Arkansas, and I say slightly because he scored 50 points, and he still threw for 8 yards an attempt. So I really think Mond has a tremendous amount of potential, probably to maybe be one of the best quarterbacks in the conference. So of course he's one of the best. He's going to be the best Florida's faced.
And just real quick, touch on also the running backs, because I think this is in if you separate them out, this is still the best. If you take the best quarterback from any team that they play this year and the best running back core from any team this year, I think A&M has them both in one game, and we know Florida struggled a lot with the run game. So talk about that a little bit. Do you agree in terms of running backs, or is maybe Kelly at Tennessee that much better than what A&M has, or Snell at Kentucky? Talk about that real quick.
Yeah, I can agree with that too. I mean, Snell is a good back. Kelly is a good back. Sure, Geis is a good back, and they're all solid. I think Kelly is a little bit overrated because we've seen what happened when he played better teams. I think Kelly was more a function of, and I hate to say this, but to some extent, I think Kelly was the one that exposed Florida's linebackers to me. And Geis at LSU, I really felt like was always a byproduct of the passing defense, rushing defenses he faced. We talked about that a lot last year on our show, that his rushing numbers all came when Fournette was out. Fournette happened to play against the good teams at the beginning and the end of the year. Geis just faced the Missouri, Arkansas, Ole Miss stretch that were Mississippi State that were all terrible rush defenses. Travion Williams and Keith Ford are elite backs. I think Keith Ford is one of the better backs in the conference. We did a video where we named the top 5 running backs. We both put Keith Ford on that list. He's big, he's strong, he runs with power. He's really doing everything you ask of a running back in this conference. Then you pair him with a guy in Travion Williams is very good, and they've got great depth. They're rushing very effectively. And, you've got multiple backs with all 4 6-yard per carry averages. I mean, they're just really, really good at the running back position. I can't say enough about that.
All right. So instead of continuing to sort of spout doom and gloom for Florida, maybe the numbers tell us something a little different. Our computer model this week, A&M and Florida, what does it say? What do you think?
So the computer model, takes into account per play averages, uses comparative statistics to say how you did per play versus what your opponents allowed per play. We use that to extrapolate what your performance should be against this team that you're facing and then project out points. And in this case, really the story is Florida's rush defense is quite poor. 115% of opponent averages allowed. Actually, believe it or not, actually improved against LSU. It's sort of a sign of how bad LSU is, I guess, that was an improvement. But Texas A&M's very good in rush defense, 83% of opponent averages. They fell quite a bit against Alabama. Alabama actually ran the ball quite a bit better than you'd expect against A&M. It's also relative, but A&M had been very good against the run. The problem is the pass. Florida 101% of opponent averages in the pass, and A&M 93%. A&M is serviceable, and Florida has been more on the side of bad. Again, Florida's had the advantage of playing very weak teams in the East. The East is particularly bad this year, and LSU can't throw forward passes to save their life. A&M has generally been a little bit vulnerable through the air, and Alabama kind of failed to exploit it, but Arkansas really didn't. So that's been their Achilles heel to this point in the season. When you move down from that, the whole problem here is A&M's weakness is pass defense, and their strength is run defense. That means Feleipe Franks needs to pass to win the game. That's not a good thing. Florida's projected to only get 3.5 yards per carry, but 7.2 yards per attempt. A&M's projected to get 5.7 yards per carry and 6.9 yards per attempt. So, A&M may not be projected to throw the ball all that well, but still pretty well. The problem is they're going to run the ball for quite a bit more. And the difference in yards per play, 6.3 for A&M, 5.4 for Florida doesn't sound like much, but it turns into a 40 to 23 point spread. The reason for that, and the reason this is projected to be such a blowout really, is that they're much better at sustaining drives, and Florida does not turn points yards into points. It's a Nussmeier thing. They've done it for a long time, and A&M should be able to sustain drives and score.
Wow. I don't I don't see how either of these teams get that many points, either 40 or 23 for their respective selves. I do agree with the model. I think A&M is a better defense than they're getting credit for. And I think Florida's reputation as a defense might still be living a little bit off of what they've done in the past, because we've seen it consistently all year that they've not been a good run defense. And that's really what they need, because their offense doesn't produce where it needs to be. So they need that defense to kind of find them some short fields or some turnovers, and we saw it in the Michigan game. I think that Mond is really coming on. You and I both talked during the Alabama A&M game how he was reading Alabama's corner and safety blitzes really well. I mean, he was finding his immediate check, his immediate read in a blitz almost every time, and it was usually Keith Ford in the flat, but that's a read that Jalen Hurts wasn't making by the LSU game last year. We talked about that time and time again, how they were sitting in a corner every play. Jalen Hurts never read it, and they had to struggle to get 10 points. Well, we didn't see Mond struggle with that at all in this game. And I think a lot of the perception of A&M is based on the fact that, one, they gave up a huge lead against UCLA, but you had a situation where your starter coming into the year leaves the game. Mond comes in really raw and had to kind of hold on, but he came in too early. I mean, like you said, he came in too early. So he's progressed throughout the year faster than I think any of us have expected. So I think he's going to test this Florida defense, but I also think A&M is going to come in a little too high. Just to bring them down to earth a little bit, there's one wide open pass play. I know the tight end was covered up, but there's one wide open pass play away from that game being 31-3. There's one sideline fade away to Devonta Smith from that game being 31-3. So for all of the stuff that happened to get them back in the game, and credit to them, they did it, it could have been bad in the other direction. So I think they're going to come in a little high. I still have them winning this game, but not a blowout. I think this is the first time I've disagreed with the model this year in terms of spread. Give me A&M 23, Florida 16.
Interesting. Yeah, this is probably the first time this year that we really disagree to a certain extent. We still have the same winner, but I actually agree with the model. In fact, I think it could be a little bit worse. I do think Mond is really hitting his stride, and he did come in too early, as we said, and we talked about that a little bit in the Alabama Arkansas preview too. That he's had to have time to season himself, and he's getting there, and he's turning the corner, and I think he's going to be one of the better quarterbacks in the conference. I think this is more like a 41-17 game. I think A&M is completely capable of blowing out Florida, and I think A&M is rounding into shape as one of the better teams in the conference. You look at A&M's schedule, and it's hard to see a whole lot of losses. I think Texas A&M, way too much is made of that early game again, where they are up on UCLA. They're dominating that game on both sides of the ball. They lose focus. They get tired. They're not doing a very good job of putting the game away and burning clock. And they end up giving a lot of yards passing to UCLA. Nobody else in this conference has a quarterback like UCLA does. There's no Rosen in the SEC. So, with the two losses to UCLA and Alabama, it's going to be tough for them to make the SEC championship, even if they end up with a three-way with Alabama and Auburn. At this point, they're probably going to lose that tiebreaker. So, you kind of look at the rest of the schedule, though. Florida, Mississippi State, New Mexico, Ole Miss, LSU. I think they're heavy favorites against all those teams, and I think they're playing at a high level. They have a great rush defense, and that's going to give them a chance to beat all of them. The one game there is that Auburn game, and I think personally that game is more of a toss-up than people are giving them credit for, because again, A&M has shown the ability to stop the run. They have a mobile quarterback that can generate points, and by that point in the year, which you got about another month before that game takes place, he's going to be that much more developed. So I really feel like A&M is. I think they're actually turning the corner to turn into a better team. It's going to be curious to see how that's sustained this year versus next. And they've already felt, I think, the loss of receivers, and I think they've got some guys coming in, but they're not as good as the Speedy Oil in that crowd. And next year they'll lose Kirk, but I think it's very likely they're going to finish 9-3 or 10-2. And then on the flip side, Florida, man, I see a lot of struggles. I just don't see Florida being a very good team. It was hidden by their bad opponents in the East, but I don't see them beating A&M, and I don't see them beating Georgia. And when it's 3-3, I kind of wonder how they're going to handle it. But yeah, regardless, I don't see this being a close game. I think this is going to be a big gap. I think this Vegas line that favors Florida by 3.5 is just ridiculous, frankly. And I don't get it. I don't see it. The numbers don't see it. And I don't just think Florida's going to lose this game. I think they're going to lose it by a significant margin.
And just kind of like the Auburn game that we talked about earlier, we've identified a couple of times this year where we thought Vegas was crazy. Auburn, LSU, Georgia, Tennessee, now this game as well. I don't see it either, especially since we saw Florida put a pretty good defensive performance up against an LSU offense that you and I both have very little respect for at this point. And I don't think that Geis is fully healthy, and even healthy, I don't think he's as good as he's given credit for, at least in terms of production. I think Ford's going to have a day. I think Ford's going to go like a $135, 6.8 yards per carry kind of day. I don't think Mond is going to have a whole lot of success. Like you said, on the road, there's going to be some jitters, but I don't know that he's going to have to. Okay, we do this sometimes. If Florida is able to win, give me their MVP for the game. If A&M wins the game, who do you think's the MVP?
Florida's MVP, I think a lot of Florida fans are immediately going to say it's Malik Davis, because there's a lot of excitement about Malik Davis and what he's been able to do the last few weeks. And he's certainly been a bright spot for that offense, right? I mean, Malik Davis has ran well. He shows a tremendous amount of potential. He has a tremendous amount of talent. 7.3 yards per carry against Vandy, 6.4 yards per carry against LSU. The problem is, I don't think people appreciate how bad Vanderbilt and LSU are defensively against the run. They're both giving up over 100% of opponent averages. And I just don't think it's realistic to expect that could really even possibly happen against A&M. I think successful for him is sustaining drives at some level, not dominating the game. I think for Florida to win this game, they're going to have to throw the ball. And Feleipe Franks is going to have a successful game where he's as efficient as a passer. And remember, A&M's weakness is in pass defense, not run defense. So for Florida to win the game, I think the MVP would have to be Feleipe Franks, exploiting what is a vulnerable Texas A&M pass defense, and exploiting him in a way that Jalen Hurts wasn't able to do in a hostile stadium at A&M. On the flip side, if A&M wins the game, who's the MVP? My guess is Mond, and I don't think it's going to be so much through his arm. I think it's going to be through his legs. I think he'd probably have to hit some big plays through the air to kind of keep things honest. But the biggest thing is, again, it's going to be tough for those Florida linebackers to deal with the inside run with very good backs with Williams and Ford, to be able to maintain the responsibilities in the screen game, both running back screen and outside receiver screens, and all the short yardage passing stuff. And at the same time, contain that quarterback, keep him in the pocket, and keep him from taking his own read. And I think I think it's probably the likely result that Texas A&M wins this game. They're going to do it because Mond takes advantage of opportunities, scrambles, and has some really big plays on the ground, and probably a lot of rushing yards, honestly. And that's what you see when you see linebackers that struggle is, it's one thing to deal with the running backs and deal with the primary responsibility, but linebackers that don't react well and tackle well really, really struggle with dual threat quarterbacks that like to run on the edges.
Well, we'll have to see. Both of us think that A&M wins this game. Florida fans, after last week, probably are completely checked out on our show at this point. But y'all, again, like I told Arkansas fans earlier, hang with us. I mean, we don't sugarcoat things, but we do tell you generally we're honest and we go where the numbers go, and more often than not to toot our own horn, but we're right. When it says blowout, it's usually blowout. When we identify when the model's off, we usually do a pretty good job of that as well. So, Florida fans, it's nothing personal. We hope you stick around because we think there's going to be some positives that we can talk about in your team later in the year. But right now, we're kind of going where the numbers are taking us, and right now they're taking us, I think, to an A&M win.